Sister Frances stepped out of the church and into the bright morning sun. She closed her eyes and smiled as she tilted her head toward the sky. She breathed in the crisp air. She always felt invigorated after morning mass. Today there was an extra spring in her step as she walked. She had been at the convent for 20 years now, and today would be her first day working with the relics. She stopped to smell the red roses that grew in the garden. She held her robe in place as she leaned out of the large arches so she could put her nose near the flowers. She sat on the low stone wall under the high arch. She had dreamt of this day ever since she first laid eyes on the holy relics. They were the lifeblood of the church. 2 young sisters walked by and they lowered their heads as they passed. Sister Frances raised her hand to them. The convent was silent at this hour and no one spoke a word. Sister Frances looked at the roses a few more moments before she stood and continued her morning rounds. She walked to the common room. A number of sisters mulled around. They drank coffee, read the newspaper, filled out the crossword, and sat with their own thoughts. They were enjoying the still, silent time of day. Sister Frances made herself a cup of tea and looked at the headlines on the newspapers spread on the table. She finished her drink and went to check that the novices were at their chores and that they didn't need any help. Sisters Agnes and Elizabeth were tending the garden. Frances did not interrupt them as she made her way back to the church, cracked the door and peeked inside. She didn't want to bother the young novices, and she could see Sister Carol tidying up around the altar. The sound of a vacuum came from somewhere inside, and she knew Sister Priya was hard at work as well. She smiled again as she remembered what it was like coming to the convent as a young woman. That felt so long ago. She was an entirely different person now. She looked once more at Sister Carol obediently working and wondered what kind of woman the young nun might become. With her rounds completed, it was time to speak to the abbess, the head of the nuns. She felt a flutter in her stomach. The nervous excitement made her skin tingle. The hair on her arms stood on end as she thought about seeing the relics again, about working on them, tending to them. She had seen them once as a novice. She hadn't known her way around the convent yet, and when asked to retrieve a book from the library, she accidentally opened the door to the reliquary. This seemed absurd to Frances now. The reliquary was a place of extreme sanctity, and everything about it sung that fact. The door was beautifully carved, and a large lock kept it secure, but it had not been locked that day. Frances had opened it, she remembered. Before she knew what she had done, she was being pushed out and chastised by a sister. But for a fleeting moment, Frances had glimpsed the relics behind the red curtain that covered the interior door. She remembered crying tears of joy as the abbess whipped her. She felt no pain as she remembered the splendor of those holy relics. Now she stood in front of the abbess's door. The stern leader of their convent was a fair woman. She did care about the sisters, but was not one to smile freely. But her face beamed with joy when she had told Sister Frances it was her time to tend to the relics. Frances had fallen to her knees when she heard this. She had held the hem of the abbess's robe as she cried tears of unbridled joy. Now, she knocked on the door in front of her.
"Come in."
The abbess's voice was muffled behind the door. Frances opened it and stepped into the office. The abbess worked behind a computer that sat on a fine wooden desk. She looked at Frances over the top of her glasses before she removed them and walked to her. The abbess smiled and put her hands on Frances's shoulders.
"It's time, sister."
Frances could see the warmth in her eyes as she said this. She swallowed a lump in her throat. The time for tears had passed. Frances smiled back and said nothing. The abbess took her hand and led her from the room. They walked hand in hand through the ancient stone walkways. Beams of sunlight lit their way. The bright rays shined through the open arches in the walls. Sister Francis's heart began to race as they got closer to the reliquary. The abbess tightened her grip around Francis's hand, firm but gentle, as if she could sense Francis's excitement and nervousness. They stood in front of the reliquary entrance. Francis was filled with awe as she stared at the gigantic wooden door. The dark timber was carved with scenes of spiritual warfare, of battles between the legends of heaven and hell. She again choked back her budding tears as she thought of these brave, holy warriors. The abbess let go of Francis's hand and removed a large iron key that hung from her belt. She paused for a moment and then unlocked the door. The abbess opened the door and they both stepped into the small entrance chamber. It was simple, empty besides a tall pedestal with a bowl of liquid sitting on top. A red curtain covered the entrance into the reliquary itself. The abbess stepped aside and gestured for Francis to move forward. Sister Francis walked to the pedestal. She dipped her index and middle finger into the bowl. With her fingers together, she dragged the tips from each temple to her chin. She dipped her fingers once more, this time dragging them from the center of her forehead down across her cheekbones. 2 red triangles, one pointing up and the other down. "As above, so below," she said. The blood was still warm on her face as she pulled the curtain open. Detective Sarah Johnson rubbed her eyes as she sat at her metal desk in the precinct station. 5 photographs were spread in front of her. She took a deep sip of her 5th coffee of the night. She looked up at the cheap clock that hung on the wall. It was 2 a.m., and she had been trying to make sense of this mess all day. The 5 men had disappeared months ago, seemingly unconnected cases that had gone to various teams. But today they had found a connection, and the case had landed on her desk. Detective John Phillips walked into the office. He carried a paper cup in his hand, and he pulled a chair up to Johnson's desk. He had been pulled off his current case to work on the disappearances. Now he was eager to see what was so urgent. He looked over the pictures and began speaking without looking up at Johnson.
"So what the hell is all this? These are the guys that flashed out a few months back, right?" "Yeah, no trace. Then why are we here?" "Well, this..." She hovered her hand over the photos. "All seems to be connected." "Huh?" John said. "Yeah, you know that new girl down in forensics? A little woo-woo?" "Oh yeah, with the crystals. I'd like to realign her chakras if you know what I mean." He smirked. "Jesus, John. What?" He raised his hands in a shrug. "Anyways, she was looking over the data and noticed that these guys..." Again she gestured over the photos. "Had a very specific star sign." "What, like they're all fucking Leos?" She laughed. "Not quite. They're, Johnson rummaged around the pile of papers on her desk. She couldn't remember what the lab coat had said, but she wrote it down. "Here it is." She read from a yellow post-it note. "Aries ascendant with Venus in 5th and Jupiter in 8th. "Oh yeah, me too actually," Philip said, sipping loudly from his cup. He raised his eyebrows when Johnson looked up at him. "Hilarious." She shook her head. "Listen, John, I'm not asking you to believe in this shit, just to fucking listen, alright?" He held his hands up defensively. Alright, sorry." "Anyways, obviously she wasn't just gonna tell us this astrology shit. She followed a hunch and looked for any connections at all." Johnson rummaged in the pile as she spoke. She picked out a stack of papers. "Blood type." She dropped a paper on the table. "Bone marrow." She dropped another. "DNA markers." Another paper hit the table. "That last one was a doozy, John. Check this out." She slammed one final paper on top of the others and held her hand over it. "Heritage," she said, removing her hand. Phillips looked at the paper, squinting. "What am I looking at here exactly?" "Brothers, John. They're all goddamn brothers."
John leaned back in his chair.
Jesus.
Sister Frances took a deep breath and exhaled as she walked into the reliquary. She let the red curtain fall behind her. The room was brightly lit and sterile. The walls were white and unadorned. In front of her were 5 naked men. They were each strapped to a metal contraption. Their knees were resting on platforms and their chests were propped against flat supports. Their arms were stretched in front of them, also strapped in place. Their heads were kept still by cords of gold bolted to their skulls. The lump returned to Frances's throat as she laid eyes on these golden halos. She wiped tears from her eyes as she finally saw the relics in their pure, holy glory. She noticed Sister Liliath sitting behind one of the men. Liliath looked up, and a smile spread across her face. She put a set of tools in a tray next to her, and they clattered with a metallic sound. She stood up and ran to Frances, embracing her in a tight hug and then holding both of her hands gently.
Sister Frances! Liliath!
Frances smiled back at her, both of their faces full of warmth. The triangles of blood on Liliath's face had dried now. Small cracks spread, and the white skin beneath showed like pale veins.
Come.
Liliath hurried to grab a chair. A tray was attached to one arm, and a set of metal tools rested there.
You will be tending to Asmodeus.
She pulled the chair in place in front of the man directly in front of Frances.
Don't thank me, Frances. This is where you are meant to be.
She again smiled her warm smile. Frances sat in the chair. She checked the monitor connected to the IV in the man's arm. Everything was correct. She removed a disposable razor from the tray and began to shave the stubble from the man's head. The light reflected off the polished gold that held his head steady as she worked. She finished and placed the razor back on the tray. She reached down and held the man's hand. She squeezed it gently. "Thank you," she thought. She picked up a scalpel and dragged the razor-sharp edge down the center of the man's skull. Blood flowed from the incision. It seeped down and hit the edges of the golden halo and flowed into hidden openings. She peeled the skin from the skull, folding the flaps of flesh over each side of the halo. She wiped the now bare skull with a cloth, and her heart began to race as she looked down at the bright, white bone in front of her. She heard a sound, a deep, faint groan. She pushed her chair out behind herself and kneeled in front of the man. She could see his eyes darting frantically now, the low groan struggling to escape from his paralyzed mouth. Tears were falling from his eyes. She looked at him, her face full of love. She wiped his tears with one bare hand while she adjusted the IV controls with the other. She watched as the man's eyes again went still. The groans weakened and finally stopped. Sister Frances pulled her chair back in place and sat. She removed a metal pick from the tray, leaned over the man's skull, and got to work.
"This is the place,"
Johnson said as she slowed the car down and looked at the map on her phone. The sign read Shady Acres, and Johnson turned onto the road leading into the retirement community. They were stopped at the gate. They flashed their badges, and the security guard waved them through. The road was paved with fresh black asphalt, and the sidewalks were lined with transplanted palm trees. They passed single-story buildings as they drove, groups of 3 or 4 clustered together. They had signs with the names like Coconut Grove and Pineapple Terrace. Johnson looked down at her phone again.
"We're looking for palm shades."
She looked out the window and slowed the car to a crawl. She turned the wheel hand over hand as they made their way around a rotary.
"I think this is where Jimmy went when he died,"
Philip said.
"Jimmy?"
Johnson was still looking out the window.
"Buffet, come on." "Nah, he's already a god in Margaritaville." "True."
Phillips frowned and shrugged as he raised his eyebrows.
This ain't a bad place though, really.
He looked around.
Here it is,
Johnson said, ignoring him. She pulled the car into a parking spot near Building 9. They stepped out of the car and into the heat of the day, their dark sunglasses fighting to block the sun's rays. They went to the apartment they were looking for, number 27, and Johnson knocked. "So how old is she anyways?" Phillips asked her. "At least 90. Only one of the brothers, Ken Carter, had any relatives still alive. They had found that his mother had been living in Shady Acres for 30 years. The door opened. It was stopped by the still attached chain. An old woman looked at the pair through the crack. "Yes?" Her voice was soft. Johnson held up her badge. "Hello, Mrs. Carter. Could we talk to you?" Mrs. Carter looked at the badge and then at Johnson. She hesitated before answering. Yes, come in." She unchained the door and opened it, welcoming the 2 police officers inside. The apartment was clean. They entered the kitchen. A large oak table stood in the centre. A small living room was beyond this. It was furnished with a couch and an armchair. The shelves that lined the walls were covered in old romance novels and clay figurines. "You have a beautiful home." Johnson meant what she said. The apartment reminded her of her own grandmother. "Oh, it's nothing, but thank you. Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you. This won't take long." "I'll take one, actually," Phillips said as he looked around. Johnson shot him a look, and he smirked at her in return. "Please sit." Mrs. Carter gestured to the table as she turned to the coffee machine. "So, what can I do for you officers?" She put a filter into the machine. The officers pulled wooden chairs out from the table and sat. "Well, we hate to bring up old wounds, but it's about your son." "Oh, it's okay. Anything to help." She took a coffee tin down from the shelf and got a spoon from the drawer in front of her. "Thing is, we found out his disappearance is connected to 4 others." "Oh?" There was a slight sound of doubt in Mrs. Carter's voice as she said this. She scooped the coffee into the filter. "Yeah, and please don't take this the wrong way, but was Ken adopted?" Johnson asked as politely as possible. "What? Why?" Mrs. Carter's voice wavered again. Phillips furled his eyebrow as he looked at her. He still said nothing. "Well, Mrs. Carter, Ken and the other men, they're brothers." Mrs. Carter stopped scooping the coffee, putting the spoon down on the counter. She opened the drawer again, and her hand came out with a large chef's knife. Phillips was already out of his seat, but it was too late. Mrs. Carter turned to the officers. A wild smile was spread across her wrinkled face. She brought the knife to her throat and, still smiling that horrible smile, said, "As above, so below," before dragging the blade across her neck. "Jesus Christ!" Johnson yelled as she fell from her chair and crawled to Mrs. Carter's side. She reached up and pulled a cloth from the door of the stove and pressed it into Mrs. Carter's neck. It did nothing to stop the blood. Mrs. Carter's head was nearly severed from her neck, and her blood spurt from severed arteries to the slowing rhythm of her dying heart. Phillips had pulled a radio from his belt and was calling in for backup and paramedics. He stared at the puddle of blood pooling beneath Johnson as she desperately tried to keep Mrs. Carter alive. The blood had stopped its violent spurts. It trickled pathetically down Mrs. Carter's pale skin, soaking into her flower-patterned nightgown as she died. The ecstatic smile was still stretched across her pale face. Phillips sat back down at the table. His eyes glazed over as he sat in silence. The radio hummed with frantic but deliberate voices. Johnson leaned back against the stove and looked at the red puddle seeping under her. Phillips finally spoke. "What the fuck?" Sister Frances dragged the sharp pick down the centre of the man's skull, carving a single line in the white bone. The feeling of the pick scraping, the sound of it, sent shivers of joy down her spine. Finally, she was here. She continued scraping. She carved strange patterns into the bone. Sacred geometries taught to her by the sisters in the convent. Her focus was absolute as the grim mandala began to take shape. She paused for a moment and looked over her work. She smiled, tilting her head as she inspected the patterns in front of her. She wiped the skull with a cloth, cleaning it gently. She dipped her fingers into a pot of dark red powder. With great care, she rubbed the powder over the skull. She was gentle as her fingers caressed the sacred bone. Skull was coated in the powder. She again wiped it clean. She was filled with awe when the pattern was fully revealed. The shapes she had been carving were now highlighted in red, standing in stark contrast to the bright white of the surrounding bone. Frances sat back and admired her work. He looked at the man and made sure that he was still unmoving and silent. She looked over to Sister Lilith, who was working hard, her face a mask of concentration as her hands moved across the back of the man she sat behind. Frances wanted Lilith to look at her work. She stood and walked to where Lilith was working. Lilith did not look up. She did not seem to notice that Frances was standing next to her now. Frances looked at Lilith's work. The beauty of it overwhelmed her. The skin, muscle, and fat of the man's back had been peeled off of his spine and ribs. It was gently tucked around his sides. The reds, purples, and yellows were beautiful to Frances. She took a moment to admire the way they settled into perfect layers, like the colours of a rainbow. Frances admired Lilith's skill with the scalpel. The way she cut the flesh so that the majority of the blood flowed down and into a receptacle below the man. The little that did end up colouring the white bone was gently washed away by Lilith. She was carving beautiful patterns into the man's ribs now. She deftly scraped her pick against the bone and then methodically wiped the area clean. Frances let out a faint gasp as she saw the man's heart beat slowly behind his ribs. Lilith's hand stopped, and she finally noticed Sister Frances.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean...
Frances was horrified that she had interrupted the sister's holy work.
No, Frances. It's okay. It's beautiful, Lilith. Thank you, sister. But I can't take credit.
She touched her fingertips to her forehead and then her chin, the sign of their order.
He guides our hands from below. You have a moment, could you look over my work? Of course, please.
Lilith gestured toward the man Frances was working on. She placed a wet cloth over her own canvas before following Frances across the room. Held Frances's hand as they both looked at the lines that patterned the skull.
This is wonderful, Frances. I can see the care you took to not dig too deeply.
Frances blushed. It was difficult for her to accept praise from a sister.
Thank you.
Lilith ran her fingers down the man's arm. His hair stood on end as goosebumps bloomed across his skin.
I believe you have time to do one arm before the penitariat arrives.
The mention of that name, the penitariat, sent a shiver of awe down Frances's spine. She had never seen the 5 sisters of the penitariat and had only heard hushed rumours of the sacred rituals they performed in the reliquary.
I can, Lilith, if you trust me too. I do.
Again, Lilith smiled at Frances, still holding her hand. Detective Johnson ducked under the yellow caution tape that blocked the open door to Mrs. Carter's apartment. She walked through the kitchen where the 2 officers were bent over the old woman's body. She found Philip standing next to the coffee table in the living room. They had found a safe behind one of the bookshelves, and after cracking it, they had found a pile of books inside. Phillips had these books spread out on the table.
Interesting reading for an old lady,
he said. He pointed the books in the succession as he spoke.
The Lesser Key of Solomon, 3 books of occult philosophy, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. Real spooky, John. but you can pick this shit up at Barnes and Noble's after you get your pumpkin spice,"
Johnson said, looking down at the table.
"Right."
Phillips dropped a book he was holding onto the table.
"Jesus, what the hell is that?"
The book was bound in dark brown leather, and iron rivets held it together. Latin writing was burned into the cover. Phillips pointed at the writing.
"Liber Rosarum, the Book of the Rose," he said. "Yeah, I think I skipped over this one at the airport,"
Johnson said. Phillips smirked at her. Johnson settled onto one knee next to the table and opened the book. The thick, dry pages were covered in writing that she did not recognize, but the illustrations painted a clear picture. Diagrams of human bodies with their skin flayed open covered the pages. Tools drawn to detailed specifications accompanied these drawings. Other pages showed close-ups of bones with strange patterns covering them.
"We also found this."
Phillips dropped a folded map on the table. It had been marked in red pen. A circle marked a seemingly empty spot of wilderness. Below this was written, "The Convent of the Rose." Frances paused as she held the scalpel above the man's biceps. She closed her eyes and bowed her head in prayer.
"Morning star, bright prince of the abyss, please fill me with your light and guide me today,"
she said softly. She opened her eyes and pressed the scalpel gently into the flesh. She methodically opened the man's arm, carving layer by layer deeper toward the bone. She took great care not to cut into the bone as the flesh opened like the petals of a flower, each layer falling gently out of the way as the scalpel cut deeper. She saw the bone and stopped. She removed a tool from the tray and used it to spread the man's flesh, exposing this humerus. She focused and carved away at the bone. Her mind felt clear. It felt free and purposeful as she worked. She had images of boundless light floating through her mind as she scraped the bone. Images of radiant messengers telling her how important this work was. She pictured the door of the reliquary, the carvings of leather-winged warriors defending her prince from the foul, six-winged seraphim sent by the betrayer to destroy his sacred home. The distant sound of helicopter blades suddenly broke the silence. Frances did find this curious, but it was not alarming. She continued to carve into the man's arm. As she began to apply the powder, she noticed the sound of the helicopters coming closer. Very close. The sound was near, and the power of the spinning blades could be felt in the room as the helicopters hovered somewhere outside the convent. Frances was worried, and she looked at Sister Lilias, who had also stopped her work. The sound of the door's lock shifting and the door slamming open was followed shortly by the abbess bursting into the room. 5 women followed behind her, their bodies covered by black robes and their heads hidden by white masks. The Pentariat, Frances thought. She was overwhelmed by confusion as she saw the women rush in. She saw something on the abbess's face she had never seen before. Panic. Frances felt fear for the first time since the sisters had rescued her.
"Who is ready, Lilias?"
The abbess's voice was strong, but with a hint of nervousness. Lilias was overwhelmed, her eyes darting over the 5 men in the room.
"Sister!" "Yes, Abbess."
Lilias came to her senses.
"Zazil, Agurus, and Andras."
She pointed to each of the men that her and Frances were not tending to. Each of them showed a latticework of white stitching over their bodies, seams sewn carefully by the sisters.
"Help me move them,"
the abbess said, as she grabbed hold of the metal frame that the nearest man was strapped to. Frances and Lilias helped her drag the men into a circle, their heads facing each other. The steel racks scraped loudly as the paralyzed men were dragged into formation. The IV bags attached to each of them swayed as they moved. The 5 masked women walked into the center of the circle. Frances watched as they put their hands on the men. Frances put her own hand on the back of Asmodus. She wanted to comfort him as she tried to grasp what was happening. In truth, the feeling of his skin under her shaking hand grounded her. She watched as the women began to chant. The sound brought a sense of dread over her. The helicopters began to fade. In their place came the sound of muffled shouts and the concussion of gunshots. Frances crouched behind Asmodus, still keeping her hands on his paralyzed body. She was confused and scared as she watched the women conduct their arcane ritual in the center of the circle of living relics. The chaos outside was coming closer now. Frances's body shook with every gunshot she heard. She held herself close to Asmodus now, pressing herself against his back. She held her ear to his ribs and could hear the sound of his heart pounding slowly between the cacophony. The dreadful chants of the Pentariat blended with the shouts and gunshots now. 3 sisters burst through the red curtain, each holding a rifle in their arms.
"Are they ready?"
They shouted towards the abscess as the gunfight continued outside the door.
"Almost,"
Abbess said back, her face twisted into unbridled panic. Frances peeked from behind the back of Asmodus, now dreading whatever she might see. The bodies of the relics now glowed with red patterns. The sigils carved into their bones burned through their flesh as the Pentariat finished their arcane chanting. The relics' eyes came alive then, and their muscles tensed as they strained against their restraints. They began to scream, a terrible sound that came from deep within them. The women of the Pentariat reached down and pressed a button on each of the relics' rack, releasing all of their restraints. The Pentariat stayed completely still. They made no sound as the relics ripped them apart.
"Go!"
The abbess now had a stern look on her face as she commanded the relics. They looked up at her, blood dripping from their wild mouths as they chewed flesh. They saw the abbess's hand pointing towards the door, and their eyes widened as they heard the fight outside. They dropped the limbs they had been gnawing and moved with blinding speed out of the reliquary. Frances hyperventilated as she hid behind Asmodus. She could hear the sounds of gunshots outside, mixed between the sounds of screaming and tearing flesh. She cried as she released Asmodus from his restraints. He fell from the metal rack and crumbled to the floor. She tried to pick him up, but he slipped from her arms, crashing again to the floor. The golden halo attached to his skull smashed against the ground as he fell. She sobbed as she used all her strength to drag him to the corner of the room. His IV was torn from his arm as she pulled him across the floor. The peeled skin of his arm and skull flapped as they moved slowly. Finally, Frances curled into the corner. She embraced Asmodus and sobbed into his shoulder as she listened to the chaos outside. A series of explosions shook the reliquary. The tools on the metal trays rattled with the shockwave.
"Clear,"
Frances heard someone say at the threshold of the door. She watched in horror as 6 men wearing camouflage streamed into the room. The 3 sisters armed with rifles did not stand a chance as they raised their weapons. Each one slumped to the ground as rounds ripped through their faces. The abbess and Lilith charged towards the gunmen. They were shot down as easily as the others. Frances was hysterical now, sobbing and shaking as she clutched Asmodus closer. His limp body twisted as she pulled. She could hear him begin to groan, the IV no longer keeping him sedated. The sound was quiet at first, but it grew louder as he desperately tried to cry out to the world. Detective Johnson entered the room after the tactical team had cleared it. She could hear the chatter over the radio as she walked into the sterile chamber.
"What the? Jesus! Someone get the paramedics! What the fuck are they gonna do?"
The men's voices overlapped on the radios as the adrenaline left them and the reality of the situation took over. Johnson could see them standing near a circle of medical-looking furniture. She walked to them, holstering her pistol as she moved. She stepped between two of the men and looked down to see what they were staring at. She gasped, covering her mouth as she saw the pile of cloth and torn flesh. She heard the wet sound of vomit splashing against the floor and turned around. She hadn't noticed Phillips. He was behind her, his hands on his knees as he retched.
Fucking what the... Jesus!
He said between convulsions. He tried not to look at the paralysed man strapped to the metal rack in front of him. The man's back was torn open, and a steady beep sounding from the machine next to him verified what his deadly eyes already showed.
Fucking brutal, man,
one of the men in camouflage said, his hand resting on the buttstock of the rifle hanging vertically at his chest.
Oh!
A terrible sound tore through the room. Everyone looked towards the source. Again, they brought their weapons to be ready. Johnson saw what they were looking at.
Hang on,
she said, holding her hand by her waist. The men lowered their weapons. She walked towards the figure cowering in the shadows. The sound continued, a terrible, loud moan. She could hear sobbing now. Finally, she could make out what she was looking at. Two bodies. One woman wearing a nun's robe. She was clutching the body of a naked man. A golden metal band circled the man's head. His eyes darted frantically, wide with terror. Drool dripped from his gaping mouth. He continued to moan, the terrible noise the only sign that he had any sense at all. The bone of his biceps was visible, the skin around it spread open by a metal tool of some kind. The skin of his skull was pulled away. Holy shit, Johnson thought to herself.
Doc, get the fuck over here,
she shouted. She recognized the emaciated, paralyzed man as Ken Carter. Her mind was a haze as she watched a medical team work. They removed Carter on a stretcher. He was still moaning. The other man left in a black body bag. They wrapped the shocked woman in a blanket and guided her out of the room in handcuffs. She showed no resistance. Johnson left the room and dreaded ever having to set foot inside again. The common room of the hospital was quiet as Ken Carter sat in his wheelchair. His unmoving head was tilted awkwardly, his chin resting on his chest. His hands sat still in his lap and drool dripped from the corner of his mouth. His diaper was thick and uncomfortable. He stared unblinkingly at the cup on the table in front of him. He concentrated as hard as he had ever before. He pulled all the strength he could from wherever it still existed. His hand flexed imperceptibly on his lap, and the cup on the table violently crumbled into a distorted, broken pile.
It's time for your bath, Mr. Carter.
A nurse came over and grabbed the handles of his wheelchair. He could feel his skin beginning to warm. He could feel the power growing slowly as the sigils carved into his bones began to burn. Nurse wheeled Ken Carter down the long hallway, and the edge of his drooling mouth twisted into a smile. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.